One of the most prominent names in horror today recently published an article that's extremely thought-provoking, and it made me wonder, why in the world do we love horror so much? I would love to get your thoughts on this. Please join the conversation. Hey everybody, welcome to D3 Reads. It's Eric. Thanks so much for joining once again. I am really excited about today's video because it was inspired by one of my favorite horror writers, and I think he's one of the more prominent voices in horror today. I'm talking about none other than Stephen Graham Jones, the author of The Buffalo Hunter, The Only Good Indians, I Was a Teenage Slasher, which I haven't read yet, and just tons of other books. He is a pretty prolific writer outside of his novel and short story writing. He has his own personal blog, and he posts on there quite frequently, and I just stumbled across it. The first article actually that I read was titled American Indian, American Horror. And this is a really very blunt assessment, kind of analysis of why horror or how horror appeals to Native Americans. And it's a really good article. I really encourage you to read it. It might make you uncomfortable, but it's thought-provoking and brutally honest. Now, I'm going to talk more about that article here in just a second. But the end result of it, after reading it, was it made me ask the question, why do we as readers love reading horror? Now, I'm no scientist, but it seems to me like there's a difference between the horror reading experience versus watching, say, horror movies. Even though, of course, they're often enjoyed by the same individual, it seems like the mechanism of the horror is just a little bit different, right? Because movies and TV shows have more tools at their disposal, right? You've got the scripting, you've got the acting skills of the actors, you've got the special effects, so the sound effects, the timing of the shots, and of course you've got the monsters, the visual imagery of the monsters or the ghosts or whatever it is that is providing the source of horror. However, with the horror novel, it's really just you and the author who are responsible for making the terror take a place in your brain. So it seems to me that the horror book reader, that fan, has made a conscious decision to enter this world with nothing but their brain and to help construct the terror that is lurking on the inside of the pages. So it seems a little bit more personal to me on that. So I wanted to discuss why it is individually that we like to read horror. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this. This is extremely subjective, and I'm not going to have all the answers or anything like that. I'm not trying to say that what I'm about to say is the only way that someone would enjoy horror. So I want to hear your thoughts. Why do you enjoy horror, and what are some of the books that best represent that? Because that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about the different types of horror and some of the best examples of that kind of maybe prove some of the points, or at least are examples of some of the points that I'm going to be making here. So in preparation for this, I did some searches on why we love horror. I wanted to see what kind of research is out there, because believe it or not, there are fear experts out there. And I found a couple of good articles. I'm going to link them in the description. The first one was one that was published on the site called thescientist.com. And they have an article called Why Do We Love Horror Movies, right? So it's not exactly what I'm looking for, but it was in the ballpark, so I went ahead and read it. And there was another article that was really interesting. It was an interview that was aired on National Public Radio, and they posted the transcript on the website called Why Do We Like Horror? And they interviewed a research specialist, I guess, who specializes in studying fear. And essentially, these two articles said much of the same thing. And it's not really, it's kind of intuitive on some degree, right? People who watch horror movies, or maybe you can assume also who read horror novels, there's a number of factors that play into why we do it, right? There's, of course, the adrenaline, right? I don't think this isn't news to anybody, right? There's the shock value, the adrenaline that you can get from the jump scare or the horrifying images or what have you, knowing that you're perfectly safe in your seat as you're enjoying this horror, the thing that grabs you the most, right? So you've got that, and one of these articles, I forget which one, pointed out that there are some people, like there's different mechanisms, safety mechanisms in your psyche that help you cope with horror. So you seek it out for the thrill, but you've got this barrier in your head knowing that you're safe. Some folks, that barrier isn't very thick, and so they decide to avoid horror. And those are the people who'd rather not read horror. But these articles, as interesting as they were, they weren't quite doing it for me because they're kind of clinical, right? They're kind of scientific. And I think the description that I'm looking for, the conversation I'm looking for, is best told by the artist and not the scientist. And that's where we get back to Stephen Graham Jones and his post. He was specifically talking about why horror, even though he acknowledges that horror is owned by everybody, it's something that everybody can enjoy, but for the Native American experience, over the past few hundred years, why certain types of horror have a very special appeal to them. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on his arguments and his. 'Cause I found it really kind of a moving kind of post, and I'm going to include a link to that article in the description so you can read it yourself, because his words, I think, are best. He's a better explainer of that of his article than I am. But what he did was he broke down various types of horror stories and explained why, from a Native American experience, we would resonate with them. But I'm going to take that approach and ask and do the same thing. We're going to talk about various types of horror, why it appeals to us, and then discuss good examples of those in various books. And I will make those recommendations based on that. So Stephen Graham Jones, in his article, kind of starts it off by saying that horror is often a cautionary tale, right? And it can provide us guidance based on the scenario playing out, and even tells us ultimately how we can live more compassionately, and more specifically, how not to die, because at its core, horror is always about survival. The characters are always, there's something horrifying, and it kicks in that survival instinct, and they want to survive. And so is it really just that thrill that draws us in? And I would argue that it's not, because something that Jones said in his article that I think really resonated with me was that despite the seeming contradiction, horror stories are often about hope. There's hope embedded in the story at some level. And now I'm going off on some of my own tangent, not necessarily what Jones said in his article, but buried in almost every horror book at some level, even the darkest, is a level of hope. And what I mean by that is based on whether it's a supernatural story or a horror story, or excuse me, a monster story or something like that, or maybe even a slasher type thing, though I'm not really a fan of slasher horror. But even with those, there is an evil force, or a force that the characters are having to reckon with, and there's a way usually to combat it, even if it seems incredibly powerful or incredibly indestructible. There's some hope that the character can survive. Even if it's not clear to the character, it's clear to the reader that if they had only done X, Y, or Z, that they could have lived. And it might align with a certain moral code. It may align with just kind of like a greater appreciation of good versus evil, or right versus wrong. But there's something in there that suggests hope, right? And I'm going to, I think, get a little bit more specific about that as we go on to the specific examples of different types of horror and why we may enjoy it. As we go through this, again, if you get a thought, if you have a counterpoint or something to build on that, let me know. Drop a comment in there about why you enjoy types of horror. To kind of start it off, to me, for horror to work, the journey of the main character to accept the fictional reality of what they're facing is absolutely essential. A good horror story, the character isn't just going to face blood and then say, oh, I guess we got a vampire we got to deal with, unless that's kind of like the context of the story that we're dealing with. But the journey from everyday Joe to someone who is grabbing a wooden stake and ready to pound it through the heart of a monster, that has to be compelling and has to be good. You got to, that journey is part of what I enjoy about a good story, regardless of what it is, because most of us aren't going to believe that there is a zombie infection until the zombies are munching on you, right? Or that there is a ghost or a haunted house or whatever it is. Most of it aren't just going to just defaults to that. So what's the journey of the character from non-believer to believer, and then having to deal with how to overcome whatever this obstacle is. So that journey is really important. And the examples that I've got that we're going to talk about here, I think, have some of the best examples of that journey for those characters. So let's start off with the different types of horror. I'm going to use Stephen Graham Jones' categories, but not all of them. So again, I encourage you to read his article. But what I'm going to talk about are these broad categories of horror types and some good examples of these horror types and why they appeal to a reader like me. And again, I would love to hear your thoughts on it. So let's start with possession horror. Stephen Graham Jones and his description of why Native Americans can completely understand or why possession stories appeal to Native Americans is really interesting. And again, I encourage you to read that. But the idea of possession horror is an alien intelligence, whether it's a ghost, a demon, whatever, can somehow wrestle control of a human, or the main character, but by extension, you, and take away what makes you you, and then use you or what was you as a vessel to do whatever unspeakable horror that they have in mind. The best example of this, I think, is 1971's The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. I've talked about this book a number of times in a couple of videos. I think it's probably, not only is it probably the most famous example of possession horror, but it is horrifying. I mean, it is one of the books that really stuck with me for years, that I found extraordinarily creepy and probably pushed me close to nightmares. It is a good horror story. In the context of that horror story, you've got this evil force. It is based upon. It's neat in that even though obviously you have the trappings of the Catholic Church and it mentions of the devil and stuff like that, you get the sense that it's even bigger than that, right? The introductory demonic forces that you're first introduced to are Pazuzu, which is a creature devil that was worshipped outside of the Judeo-Christian faith. So you get the sense that there's something even bigger going on. And because it's bigger, it's horrifying when it intrudes its way into the lives of suburban America. And not only that, but this creature chooses as its victim a child. And so that becomes even more horrifying. But there is that seed of hope in there, because whatever's going on with this creature, there is something that is ready to come up and combat it. And that's the main characters, the priests, and the family who's not willing to cede their child to this demonic force. And so you've got that battle that goes on to push this demon, this creature, away from young Reagan in the story. So this possession horror, I think, obviously the horror comes from this extraordinary power that wants to set up residence inside of us and strip away humanity. I think there's some overlap between possession horror and the next category we're going to talk about, which is vampire and zombie horror. But The Exorcist, I think, shows that good example of just, this terrifying scenario of this thing that you just can't really face. You don't even know how to fight it. The journey of the characters is really interesting. You kind of get introduced to the family at the beginning, kind of carefree, but after playing with the Ouija board, things go south, and the evidence is just kind of hard to refute, but the characters have to fall back on their faith, such as it is, as they understand it, to be able to stand up to this horror. So I found the journey of the characters from, untouched by this paranormal activity, all the way to bringing in the priest to fight this demon for them, to be really well done. Now, there's another story I read recently by Algernon Blackwood, and that was called The Listener. And this is a short story that was published in 1907. So you might not be able to find it. I think you can actually find it online for free, but I have it in my collection of Algernon Blackwood horror stories. I haven't read this whole book yet. It's just packed with short stories and novellas. But this one is it's a slightly different take on possession horror. It doesn't really touch on the religious aspect of it, but it really is cool, though. Um, in this story, and I can't talk about too much without giving away, but you have a young man who is on his own. He's young, he doesn't have any money, and he needs to find a place to live. And so he purchases or he buys a year lease at this in this house in the center of London. He can't believe his luck, but it becomes evident pretty quickly that there's a reason why this lease was so cheap. £25 for a year, I think it was. But the main character, the story was neat because it starts off pretty mundane. You know, the main character is just trying to pay bills and get work done, and he's thrilled he finally found a house, but he had this break with his sister, and so he's depressed, doesn't really have friends or visitors and that kind of thing. And after a couple of pages, I thought, wow, for a short story, it sure is taking a while to get to the meat of it. But then next thing I knew, I was deep in it, and it was really interesting. But they kind of pitched this idea of if you commit suicide, the person who committed it may be wandering around trying to reclaim a body to finish whatever, or to maybe have another shot at what it is they messed up. And then that's kind of the catalyst of what the main character has to deal with. But it's really a neat story. The listener is possession horror that you may have not have read yet. So I would recommend you check out Algernon Black. And what I like about this collection, this Gothic fantasy collection, is that it breaks his stories down into similar categories to what Stephen Graham Jones has. Well, not really similar, but the idea is the same. So they had like haunted houses and natural world kind of horror. And then I found that possession story. So possession stories are, again, they threaten what makes you you. And I think that's where the horror comes from, and we enjoy it because not only do you have the thrill of that fight, but it speaks to something bigger outside of the realm that we normally live in, and therefore it helps us, and therefore there's that seed of hope that there's a way of fighting it off. That again overlaps quite a bit with the next type of horror, which is vampire and zombie horror. Now, you could argue is a subjective assessment. What is more horrifying? Demonic forces trying to invade your body and possess you to do its evil, or the dead coming out of the grave to claim your life and turn you into a vessel to spread its evil and malignancy across the world. I tend to side on the side of the vampire. I think vampire stories, and I've said this in a number of videos, my goodness, I've done a number of videos on vampires. It's my favorite subgenre of horror. With a vampire story, often the description of the subtext of a vampire story is usually some kind of ramification for an action. You know, the original vampire stories, well, I say the original, but Bram Stoker's Dracula is obviously the most famous of these, and I think it's a standard explanation that it was talking about sexual promiscuity, right? That leads to contamination and death and living as an outcast. Kind of turned into a fanciful story of the undead. But there's more to it than that, I think. There's this whole idea of losing yourself to this alien creature, this alien intelligence. And I think the best ones, the one I like the most, are when that threat not only strips you, it doesn't just turn you into an evil you who just needs to drink blood. I think those tend to be boring. I will set the Vampire Lestat and the Vampire Chronicles as an exception to that. But usually, when you get to the Salem's Lot vampires, the characters are not just people who were killed by a vampire. Now they wake up struggling with a bloodlust. They're no longer them. They've lost that personality of who they were. The vampire, the undead version of the victim, is really unable to be called the same person. Danny Glick is no longer Danny Glick. He is a vampiric shell of what he was, and all he lives for now is serving the master and spreading vampirism and feeding that bloodlust. So So that I kind of gave away that. My best example, aside from Dracula, Bram Stoker's Dracula, is Stephen King's Salem's Lot. My favorite, I think, vampire book. Even though I have since this whole video concept was inspired by Stephen Graham Jones. Of course, he has the Buffalo Hunter, which is a Native American context story of vampires, which is really fascinating as well. I really enjoy vampire stories. I think that the draw for me with these vampire stories again that you're facing this creature of incredible malevolence that has, for whatever his objectives are, whatever his motivations are, is never a good guy. When you get good guy vampires, you lose me. I refuse to even accept that as an option. So a lot of those stories where you got the vampire heroes and you can have them. They're not for me. So if you enjoy them, you can have them, but that's not why I go to them. But there's also the ability to fight back. And the journey from believing, from being a regular person to being a believer in vampires in the story, that's where you get me. Salem's Lot was great with that because you have a whole town that is slowly being drained of its people, and until you kind of have no choice but to believe what's going on in Salem's Lot. So the journey of the characters is interesting. The type of vampire is interesting, but again, grain of hope in there. There's something bigger than the vampires that the characters have uh, to kind of come to terms with in order to be able to face the evil that is lurking in Salem's Lot and that are vampires. Related to that, of course, is zombie horror, but I haven't really read any good zombie. I haven't read any zombie books actually, but fortunately for us, my co-host Jeff, one of the first videos we ever put out was talking about a series of zombie horror audio. Well, he did the audiobook reviews called Newsflesh, and there's at least 4 books in the series, and he reviewed the first 3 of them, and he really enjoyed the Newsflesh series, and he thought that the science behind it was good, that the action behind it was good, but the horror I think is very similar to vampirism. Matter of fact, even a step more in that, at least with vampires, you usually have a kind of a central figure that is a very intelligent evil, whereas with vampire horror, excuse me, but whereas with zombie horror, you lose all that, all your intelligence, all your personality, everything that made you you is gone. And so the hope that kind of is almost purely in the act of survival from the folks that are dealing with the zombie outbreak. You draw that hope, and the inspiration and the action comes from the characters as they're trying to outrun, because usually zombie outbreaks are quite viral. They overtake, and they become apocalyptic stories. And so now you got characters who have to survive, and so it's the act of survival in the face of this evil that's swept over the land like locusts. So vampire and zombie horror, I think, are similar in that respect. It's just really the intelligence, I guess, factor of whatever it is that's driving it that kind of differentiates that. I have to give some zombie horror a try. It's never really appealed to me directly. I prefer to watch that versus read it. But if you have any recommendations on zombie horror, let me know. Now, next up, I'm going to combine 2 different types of categories, which is haunted house and ghost horror. The appeal to this is very similar, I think, to possession horror. You have these disembodied spirits that were once human, and for whatever reason, they are bound in some way to either an area or to an object or to a person to continue to kind of bridge the gulf and to make their presence known, whether for evil or to finish off something or whatever. The haunted house and the ghost story is just, it's probably some of the oldest kind of horror out there. Some of the best examples of this, I mean, there's so many good ghost stories out there. I would imagine that makes up the bulk of horror literature. But I think some of the favorites I would recommend is, well, let's go with The Haunted House, which is The Haunting of Hill House. That book, I know not it's not for everybody. I really loved the book. Shirley Jackson's classic of horror, of haunted house horror. I think really it sticks with you because with a good haunted house story, you have ghostly apparitions, but she makes it clear that the structure itself is haunted. And, again, going back to the original article that inspired the Stephen Graham Jones, he kind of frames it up, that there's been so much evil associated with a building or a place that building itself is part of the problem. And that's what we see with Hill House. Things have happened there, evil things, evil people have done things. And for whatever reason, the very structure itself has become contaminated, polluted, diseased, to the point that it is actually an infecting agent of evil. And the living have to contend with it. So, The Haunting of Hill House tells a really good story that is so very different from the Michael Flanagan version of it. I did a whole video comparing the two, the Shirley Jackson's book with Flanagan's version, that they're both very good books or very good stories in their own right, but they're so very different. So, if your only exposure to The Haunting of Hill House is the Flanagan Netflix version of it, that was a great story. I loved it, but check out the book as well. Um, Other good ghost stories, you have Joe Hill's Heart-Shaped Box. That is a neat story in itself because it's not a place that's haunted, it's a suit that's haunted. The main character in that, he's kind of a musician who he has kind of like dark tastes, and he likes to purchase things from people that have like a sinister background, so torture instruments from the medieval era or what have you. And he ends up buying the suit from a guy who died in it, and the person who sells it is clear. They said, I'm selling a ghost, I'm not selling a suit, because my dad's ghost is connected to this suit. And the main character purchases it and finds out that this ghost is there, and he's not very nice. And so, but the appeal of the ghost story is similar to possession stories, but it's a lot more personal usually. The ghost has some reason for tormenting the characters in the book. And Joe Hill's Heart-Shaped Box is a really neat version of that because there's a lot more to it than it first meets the eye. The Haunting of Hill House, the characters go to the house to study it, and they kind of insert themselves in there, but there's something sinister associated with one of the characters. It just really cool. I really like that one. But the appeal of this, I don't know, you've got this, you've got this promise of something after death, but it's not necessarily a nice thing. But there's almost always involved the ghost story, some way of placating the ghost, and maybe that's the hope that drives some of the characters. Some of it is pretty cut and dry. Sometimes you never really know what the ghosts want. Sometimes the ghosts just want death. They're just vengeful spirits, and so they're out there meeting out death. I think of The Only Good Indians is kind of that sort of ghost story. The characters aren't the supernatural forces there are there to even the score for things that happened in the past. So, ghost stories, as I mentioned before, that notion of hope sometimes is not really known to the characters in there. They're just the cautionary tale that Jones talks about. That's where the hope comes from, because after you read it, you realize, that it's like an Aesop's fable. There's a lesson to be learned that if you don't want to experience the trauma the characters faced, then don't do the horrible things that led to it in the first place. So, but what are your favorite ghost stories? Let me know, and let me know what it is that you like about them. Now, the last kind of horror we're going to talk about is kind of almost an exception to the rule because it doesn't involve hope. It doesn't really involve anything other than there's something terrible happening and there's nothing you can do about it, and that's cosmic horror. One of the most popular videos we have on this channel talks about some of the best cosmic horror authors out there. And Algernon Blackwood is one of them. But of course, the grandfather of all cosmic horror can be said to be H.P. Lovecraft. He's the guy who put it all on the map. The Call of Cthulhu and the Cthulhu mythos and everything associated with that kind of defines what we think of as cosmic horror. But in a nutshell, the characters in the stories of cosmic horror are facing something that goes way beyond their ability to comprehend. And the neat part, I think that the neat thing that H.P. Lovecraft does is he makes it clear that the characters and all the various stories that deal with his mythos, his universe that he's created, some of them try to put their arms around it, right? There are cults that worship Cthulhu and worship these other gods and what have you, but those gods have no care for them and really have no use for them. It's just kind of a feeble attempt by these insignificant mortals to tap into the power of these creatures that are beyond their understanding. And I decided to sample a story that I must have read years ago, but I had no memory of it. And it's called The Festival. And this is an early story by H.P. Lovecraft that cites the Necronomicon, which he created, and it has a really what I liked about the story is it takes a human and kind of dips him into increasingly horrifying scenario that is both supernatural and cosmic. He finds out that he is in way over his head because the main character, who you never learn his name. All he knows is that he's got roots in New England, and his family says you wants to go and participate in this festival that takes place during Christmas time. And I love the description that this, what he called Yuletide festivals, predate what he said, Bethlehem and Babylon, and goes even older than that. And these festivals are just an attempt to kind of make sense of things that are so ancient. And the character just finds himself in this really interesting little town that turns out to be something that he wasn't expecting, and the horror is just really cool. Now I don't think The Festival is one of H.P. Lovecraft's best stories, but it does, for the most part, capture some really neat cosmic horror tenets. And the reason why I said cosmic horror is kind of outside the scope is because, there's no hope when it comes to cosmic horror for the most part, because that's the whole reason behind the horror, right? Is that you're facing these things that are beyond humanity, beyond mortal comprehension, beyond mortal power to really affect. Now, obviously that's not 100% true, because like in the Call of Cthulhu itself, the main characters are able to kind of stop Cthulhu from coming into this world. So I guess there is that element of hope, but I was not a big fan of Call of Cthulhu as a story. I thought that the resolution was kind of rushed and not very plausible given what they were saying in the story. But the overall arching story was well presented. It's just the resolution I thought was kind of a cop out, if you will. But yeah, cosmic horror, I think at the very least teaches us a lesson, right? That there's a certain humility in being a humble human in this great cosmic universe that we are residents of. Those are the categories I want to talk about. There's a couple more that Stephen Graham Jones talks about in his article. Again, I encourage you to read that. But again, let me know, what is it that draws you to horror? Is there something positive out of it? Does it help you live out, does it help you make sense of a real world that's just gone crazy? What is it? What is it that drives you or that brings you back to it? Let me know, and let me know your favorites. I'm going to be putting together a horror TBR for in the next couple of months that's centered around cosmic horror. John Langan, I mentioned in an earlier video, is supposed to come out with a new book here in June called The Cleaving Stone, and I'm really looking forward to that, and I'm trying to put together a TBR centered around that release. So let me know what you're reading and what your favorite horror books are and why you love them. Thanks so much, guys, for your time. Really appreciate it. I'll see you next time.